Good evening. I just published a new book. The book is titled Megathreats, 10 Dangerous Trends that imperil our future and how to survive them. I'll give you a brief of a summary of some of the ideas of the book. And the way I think about motivating it is as follows. I was born in 1958, and I went from Turkey to Israel, to Iran, to Italy. And I came to the US for grad school around 1983. And when I was growing up and I was thinking about our world and our economy, and I think back about it, for example, I never worried about war among great powers or the risk of a nuclear war, because in the early 70s, we had the detente between the US and the Soviet Union. Nixon went to China, and the risk of war among great powers, let alone a nuclear war, pretty much disappeared. Today, instead, we're in a geopolitical depression where there are four revisionist powers: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all nuclear, that are challenging the economic, social, political, and geopolitical order that the West has created after World War II. And people are starting to think about cold wars that are becoming colder, may lead eventually to hot war. And we already have a hot war in Ukraine that could become, under some circumstances, unconventional or be extended to NATO. Or people worry about eventually a conflict between Israel and Iran, or between US and China on the issue of Taiwan. When I was growing up, the idea of climate change was not even registering on the back of my brain. Temperature were barely above pre-industrial levels in the 60s and the 70s. So I never heard about global climate change. But there were people like the Club of Rome who were worried about limits to growth, but more that there was a growth of population, we're running out of resources, food, and then there'll be a Malthusian correction, but it was not climate change. I never heard the idea or the concept of global pandemics. The last one was 1918, the Spanish flu, and unless you read the history books, pandemics, what was that? Never worried about AI, machine learning, robotic automation, destroying routine jobs, cognitive, even creative jobs, because we're in the middle of what was called an AI winter, some theory, but zero types of applications. I never worried about trade wars and deglobalization, because actually we're in the process of globalization. GATT, WTO, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, opening of China in the emerging markets, not only with the globalization, with the hyper-globalization for the last 30 years since the 1990s. I never worried about debt crisis, because the ratio of private and public debt to GDP in the world in advanced economies was less than 100% of GDP. And we had strong economic growth. So the idea of debt crisis, private and public, was not really existing. Today, that ratio in advanced economies has gone from 100% of GDP to 420 in advanced economies compared to the 70s. I never worried or even thought about implicit debt, unfunded liability coming from pay-as-you-go, social security, or healthcare system for the elderly, because there was a growing population of young people in the labor force. The elderly were still a minority, and those unfunded liabilities were not really an issue at all. I didn't worry about the idea of a great recession or a great depression 2.0, because economic cycles were relatively mild, I would say. Yes, in the 70s we had stagflation with the two oil shocks of 73 and 79, but after that we had almost 3 decades of great moderation. Low inflation, barely at 2%, reasonably stable growth, rising equity prices, falling bond yields, and rising bond prices. So you made money on both sides of a 60-40. Until the 80s and the Latin American debt crisis, the idea of severe financial crisis was, again, not something that nobody heard about. Why? We had financial repression, we had capital controls, we had reasonably good regulation supervision of the banking system. Lots of the various shadow banks and financialization and other toxic stuff had not yet been built up. So we didn't have a very severe financial crisis. And politically, I used to grow up in Italy, but if I looked at Europe, US, other advanced economies, we had liberal democracies. They were relatively stable. Yes, there were authoritarian regimes, China, Soviet Unions, and other, but they were poor countries. but you had stable, maybe center-right, center-left government division, but not the kind of polarization and partisanship that you see in the US today or in other advanced economies, let alone extremist populist party of the extreme right and left coming to power all over the world. So that's the world in which I was living. And if I fast forward to today, there are not only economic, monetary, and financial risks, and some of these risks are different than the recent past. If you're young, until recently, you never heard about inflation because inflation actually was below 2%, and now we're almost double digits. Most people never thought or heard about stagflation, that you can have high inflation recession that makes sense. Usually aggregate demand shock lead to overheating, strong growth, and inflation. That you could have a recession, inflation associated with negative supply shocks that was not on people's mind. And the idea that you could have a severe debt crisis because of explicit and implicit debt, again, was not something that was on people's mind, and today it is. So we live in a different world, a world in which the last 75 years of relative peace, prosperity, and progress may be challenged by this kind of mega threats. We live in a world in which, as I said, there is geopolitical depression, and the risk of war among great powers is rising. It could happen for a number of various reasons. We live in a world in which there is severe climate change, and the losses and the cost of it are not just 10 or 20 years from now. Look at the last summer. You had droughts in Pakistan, in India, Western Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, all the way in the US from Colorado to California. 80% of Mexico is in a drought, most of Latin America, and you name it. And the costs are becoming severe. And not only with COVID-19, but why suddenly there was no global pandemics between 1918 and 1980s. And since then, we've had what? HIV, SARS, MERS, swine flu, repeated episodes of bird flu, Zika, Ebola, COVID-19, monkeypox, and it's going to be only a matter of time when we have COVID-23, 24, you name it. Turns out there is a link between global climate change and global pandemics. As we destroy animal ecosystem and we encroach on them, there is urbanization, we damage the environment, those animals that carry pathogens, pangolins, bats, and other, become closer and closer to livestock animals and to human beings. And then the zoonotic transmission from animal to human becomes more successful, more virulent, more frequent. And that's why pandemics are becoming more severe, more frequent. In the next few years, we're going to have more of them. AI, robotic automation, does increase the economic pie, but it has lots of side effects. One is massive, permanent technological unemployment, not just routine jobs that are blue-collar, but increasingly also cognitive jobs that can be sliced in a bunch of tasks, can be automated. And now even creative jobs could be replaced by robotic and automation and AI. Give you an example. Me, like many other people maybe here, are either Fed watcher or trying to predict what the BOE or ECB or whoever does. And probably so far the best of us can do it better than a machine. But it's only a matter of time when there is going to be an AI takes a look at all the economic data, every speech of every Fed official, the reaction function of the Fed history, and all the rest, and it's going to make a prediction of what the FOMC is going to do next week, and what's going to be the statement better than the best Fed watcher. So even the finest economies eventually going to be obsolete. And today, this ChatGPT can create music, art, script, pieces of literature better than most humans. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is that technological innovation increases the economic pie, but is capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving. So if you own capital or ownership of the machine, you're going to do well. If you're in the top 10% of distribution of skills, education, human capital, like probably everybody in this room, probably the AI is going to make you productive for a while. But if you are a blue collar, white collar, low value added, or even medium value added, increasing your jobs and income is going to be made obsolete by technology. And that's the challenge. We live also in a world in which there is increasing risk of deglobalization. Initially, the backlash was because those left behind, blue-collar worker in labor-intensive industry in advanced economies. Then they were concerned about the environment, then about labor standard. But today it's geopolitics that is driving it. We talk about fair trade or secure trade rather than a free trade. We think about reshoring rather than offshoring, or friendshoring rather than offshoring, and increasing the restriction to trade in goods, in services, in the movement of capital, FDI, labor, technology, data, information. And the trend is going in that direction of more deglobalization, more decoupling, more fragmentation, more balkanization of global supply chains. And of course, that may make trade more secure, but it has cost in terms of increasing cost of production. We are also in a world in which suddenly there's a return of inflation, and there is also return of stagflation. Now, in the short run, of course, was a combination of bad policies and bad luck. Bad policy being loose monetary, fiscal, and credit policy, too much for too long. On the supply side, 3 negative supply shocks: the initial impact of COVID on production, on global supply chains and labor supply. Secondly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that impacted energy prices, food, fertilizer, industrial metals. And 3, the zero COVID policy of China that again creates friction in global supply chains. However, in the book, I make the point that there are medium-term factors, and I identify at least 11 of them, that are all stagflationary. Even if these 3 shocks were to go away, they're going to stay with us. The reduced potential growth, the increased cost of production, and the potential lead to stagflation. Deglobalization and protectionism. Reshoring of manufacturing from south to north, from low cost to high cost. Friendshoring. Aging of population. Elderly people consume and don't produce. Young people tend to save and produce. Restriction to migration that are becoming pervasive in the UK, in Europe, even the United States. In the past, migration from south to north, from poor to rich, was keeping a lead on wage growth. Decoupling between US and China, and that fragmentation of the global economy. Global climate change. As you have desertification, collapse of agriculture, food prices go higher. Food prices were already high even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even energy. We're bashing, rightly so, fossil fuel producers. They are investing into capacity. The increase in renewable production is not sufficient, so we have a structural lack of supply. Brent was already above $100 per barrel before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, pandemics lead to supply issues of various sorts, and they are stagflationary. Cyber warfare that damages production, or you have to spend a fortune to protect yourself. This geopolitical depression that is leading to fragmentation and balkanization. And 2 final factors. There has been such a rise in income and wealth inequality that now fiscal policies are becoming pro-labor, pro-union, pro-workers, pro-unemployed, pro-minorities, pro those left behind. That's good because otherwise we'll have social strife, but it increases the reservation wage and it increases wage growth. And finally, we're also weaponizing the dollar and other reserve currencies as a tool of foreign policy, imposing trade and financial sanctions against Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, and you name it. Over time, that might lead to a disorderly fall of the US dollar, that is inflationary. And secondly, in order to have a global system that works, you need something that is financing it smoothly with little cost, and that's the dollar. If you throw sand in the wheels of that process, then you increase cost of all sorts of forms of international trade. So you have these factors that are stagflationary. They're going to continue regardless of the short run. On the demand side, we live in a world in which not only there is fiscal dominance, meaning in the game of chicken between fiscal and monetary authorities, the monetary have to blink because otherwise a massive fiscal stimulus leads to spike in interest rates, like it happened in the UK 2 months ago. But we're also in a world in which there is a debt trap, the way the economists at the BS call it. There is so much private and public debt in the system that if you try to fight inflation and raise interest rates enough to bring back inflation to 2%, not only you cause a hard landing, and it's not going to be a short and shallow recession, it's going to be a severe one, but you cause a crash in the equity markets, a crash in the bond markets, a crash in the credit markets, like it started to happen this year. And that financial crash makes the recession more severe, and the more severe recession makes the financial tightening more severe in a vicious circle. In my view, faced with this economic and financial crash, central banks are going to blink. They're going to blink and they're going to wimp out. They're not going to be able to raise rates and fight inflation. And if you cannot raise taxes or cut spending, the way to reduce unsustainable debts is to use unexpected inflation to reduce the real value of nominal long-duration fixed interest rates debt. And that's what's happening right now. Of course, once you do that, inflation expectation gets de-anchored. Therefore, nominal rates go higher, real rates go even higher because you have volatility in inflation that leads to inflation risk premia, and then you have a significant rise in nominal and real rates that makes zombie household, corporates, banks, shadow banks, government, countries insolvent. So not only you have an inflation and recession, but you also have a debt crisis. In the 70s, we had negative supply shocks that led to stagflation, but debt ratios were low, 100% of GDP. So we didn't have a debt crisis in advanced economies. We had one in Latin America because they borrowed like crazy in the 70s, and when Volcker spiked rates to 20%, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil went bankrupt. After the GFC, we had a debt problem, housing debt, household debt, bank debt, but we had a negative aggregate demand shock, credit crunch, and we had lowflation and deflation, so we could do massive monetary, fiscal, and credit stimulus. Today, instead, we have the worst of the 70s because you have the short-term negative supply shocks and the medium term, and we have debt ratios that are 4 times as high as they were in the 1970s, and we have to raise interest rates into a recession rather than cutting them. So you get stagflation, and you get, at the same time, a debt crisis. Yeah, with a little bit of unexpected inflation, you can wipe out the nominal value of the debt somehow, but unless you go to very high inflation, hyperinflation, it's only a short-term effect. And once nominal real rates rise on the short and long end, then the debt crisis is only postponed rather than being avoided. So we live in a world in which there is these mega threats. Maybe I'll stop here and open the discussion, and we have to deal with them rather than kicking the can down the road. So I'll start with that. Thanks.
Thank you.